available
should you wish to make the announcement, and إن هي هتبقى broadcasted live on the ERF YouTube channel.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you, Shireen. It's actually thanks for the hope. Perfect. Well, good afternoon, everybody. We are here basically in different part of the world. I'm based in Cairo with Dr. Ibrahim, and the rest of the team is between Washington, D.C. and Tunisia. So we have different, I think, weather. Maybe we are all in the same weather season, so to speak. So season greeting to everybody, given that we are close to the Christmas time. And let me just say that we are very happy to have this panel here. The topic is very intriguing and interesting. I already got a lot of flack about the low inflation in Egypt. A couple of people sent me, do you think that this is true? Well, we will know in this session if this is the case. But let me just say that there is a translation available, and as Shireen just told me, the session is also streamed live on the ERF website. So there are a lot of means now to reach the crowd everywhere around the world. Let me just set the place for this very important session. The wording of MENA unexpectedly low inflation, as I mentioned, has brought a lot of question mark in the mind of the people who read it, because I think it is different from one country in the Middle East to the other, and definitely different between the different groups, as we will see in this presentation, the oil importing versus the oil exporting and so on. But the word low inflation, high inflation, imported inflation, stagflation, all of this will be explained and also repeated here. We'll first have Dr. Roberta basically giving us her main presentation along with Dr. Huda Asim. So let me just give you a brief introduction to Roberta. Dr. Roberta is the Chief Economist of the Middle East and North Africa region in the World Bank. She holds a PhD in economics from Harvard, and she has taught actually at Georgetown and Johns Hopkins University. So she has an academic background, and in her previous capacity as an economist, Chief Economist for Human Development, she has led the conceptualization and the release of the Human Capital Index. She is a very important activity and output. She also oversaw the Service Delivery Indicator Data Initiative. She has been very active in publishing numerous flagship reports. Her research goes from health, economics to labor markets to growth, and she had published in top journals. So welcome, Roberta, and I'm very happy that you are giving this introduction to the important report about the macroeconomic development and outlook for the Middle East and North Africa region. And what is really makes it important that it does deal with the recent event. Seldom you find economists talking about things that happened in the last couple of months, last couple of years. Usually it takes us a lot of time in order to digest But this work is important because of the time that it happens. And I will, I think, in the beginning, give either, I think maybe Huda will start first, or Roberta.
Dr. Assem, I'll actually start,
Okay.
but by starting, I will actually let you know that the star of this presentation is Dr. Hoda.
Okay.
Because I'll just provide some sort of background of the study that she will present, and then she will take on with the actual presentation. So first of all, Dr. Hassan, if I may, thank you, and thank you to ERF for being such a gracious host to the MENA Economic Update. It is by now a tradition for us to be here and be able to address your audience in the region, and we always get fantastic comments that help us make our work better and more relevant and more pertinent to what is happening in our region. So thank you so much for this. This time around, I think we're going to have a two-part engagement with you on this economic update. Today is the first, and Dr. Hoda will focus on the macroeconomic outlook, and will address the provocative part of the title about inflation. And I think she will be convincing. In January, and I think the date is January 12th, you have been also very kind to make space for us to present the second part of the report, which is focused on more structural issues rather than sort of contingent to the macroeconomic outlook of the region. And we will talk about governance and how a new concept of a learning state and of measuring and aligning incentives for accountability can really be a game changer for the region. And I think you will see a repeat of Hoda and myself, but we will also be joined by other colleagues who contributed from sectoral perspectives. Now, in terms of what we will talk about today and what we are discussing, and we welcome feedback from you today, is really how the global macroeconomic environment has changed. And, you know, we were talking about a year ago of an environment of low interest rates and no inflation, and we know that the world has changed. And essentially what we try to do with this economic update is to say, what does it mean for MENA? And we take it in two directions. And I don't want to spoil the surprise, but just to give you a sense of the two topics that Hoda will speak to, it will really be of what can we make of the increasing prices in the MENA region. And secondly, she will also speak to some vulnerabilities that we see in the region and that affect particularly oil importing countries. Of course, this is no news to everyone, is that the change in the global price environment has meant a very uneven prospect for the region, a kind of two-track growth outlook for the region, because in part we are exporting oil and in part we are importing oil and food. So let me conclude here by way of introduction and turn to Hoda, who will give you like the technical presentation, and then we look forward to getting the views of our discussants and questions from the room. But again, thank you so much for the courtesy of hosting us and being such an important forum for us to sort of learn and discuss economics about the region. So back to you, Dr. Hassan.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Roberta. I am very happy to introduce Dr. Hoda. Dr. Hoda, as Roberta mentioned, is a homegrown in Egypt from FEPS. Going to be a consultant at the Chief Economist for the Middle East was Dr. Roberta. She has her PhD in economics and MS in analysis and policy from the Paris School of Economics, joint degree in the bachelor with the University of Paris 1, the Sorbonne. I think this is what Dr. Shahir is directing. He is on the audience, so salute to the FIPS guys there. And Dr. Huda, you will have 15, 20 minutes to give your presentation, please.
Thank you very much for having us today. So I'll start by sharing my presentation. Okay. So as Roberta mentioned, today's presentation will focus on the macroeconomic development and outlook for the MENA region based on our latest MENA Economic update. So I will start by some key messages from the macroeconomic outlook of the region. So as Roberta mentioned, the global economy has transitioned from a low inflation, low interest rate environment to a high inflation, high interest rate environment. And the MENA region is facing significant vulnerabilities. First, increasing inflation, a two-track or bifurcated growth trajectory, high debt, and the lingering effects from the COVID pandemic. The report gives two key messages. The first one is that inflation in MENA, while higher than before, is still lower than expected. And we will show that this is due to product market intervention. And afterwards, we'll discuss the fiscal implication of these interventions and compare the effectiveness of different compensation schemes, comparing specifically between the general subsidies and cash transfer policies. And the second thing is that MENA oil importers particularly face rising debt vulnerabilities. So you can see here, these two panels show the prices in two commodity markets. In the left panel, you can see the hydrocarbon prices. So the devastating shocks in 2021 caused these higher prices, but also the disruptions due to the Ukraine war, which started in 2022, pushed this even further. So you can see that the disruptions in the delivery of Russian oil and natural gas due to the sanction led to a huge spike in global oil prices for both commodities, oil and natural gas. However, after rising between mid-2020 and mid-2022, the price of oil has been declining since the summer, and natural gas prices also, while it's still on an upward trend, the latest futures curve indicate a slight decrease in price. For the food markets, they also faced major disruption in the exports of grain and fertilizers, particularly from Ukraine and Russia. So you can see that wheat, corn, and fertilizer prices still remain high compared to 2021, even though they are on a declining trend, and they are still significantly higher than in 2019. And in the second part, in this slide, we focus on the move from low inflation interest rate environment to the move to high inflation, high interest rate environment. So you can see that the recent spike in commodity prices that we discussed in the previous slide accelerated an upward trend in food and energy prices. In the top panel, you can see inflation in the US and the Euro area. And the blue line represents the headline inflation, while the colored portion of each bar represents the contribution of each category to headline inflation. So between the United States and the Euro area, we can see two major differences. The first one is that inflation in the United States peaked in June at 9.1 and has fallen, reaching 7.7% in October. In the Euro area, inflation is still going strong at 10.6% in October. The second major difference we observe is that in the United States, inflation is broad-based, with core inflation contributing the most, while in the Euro area, inflation is mostly driven by higher energy and food prices. So this clearly shows that globally, inflation has increased. The two lower panels focus on the move to higher interest rate environment. So the persistent acceleration of inflation in 2022 pushed most central banks in advanced economy to tighten monetary policy more quickly and more forcibly than originally anticipated. And these higher yields in advanced economy have affected developing and emerging markets because they triggered substantial capital outflows from these markets, and this put increased pressure on the local currencies and led to currency depreciation in some countries and to increase in central bank rates and yields on government debt. As a result, this has led to increasing debt vulnerabilities in these countries. So you can see in the lower panel, the left bottom panel shows how increasing number of central banks have adopted rate hikes, which are shown in red. And on the right panel, you can see how there are an increasingly higher share of high yield bonds for emerging markets and developing economies. So in this slide we discuss the World Bank growth forecast for the MENA region. So you can see on the left panel the latest World Bank growth forecast for the MENA region, and it forecasts that the MENA region will grow at 5.5% in 2022 and by slightly lower 3.5% in 2023. And the growth will be uneven across country groups. So you can see that the GCC countries are forecast to have the highest growth in 2022 at 6.9%. They are driven by hydrocarbon exports and higher fiscal revenues for these governments. The developing oil exporters are forecasted to experience similar trend to the GCC, but at slightly lower rates. So they are forecasted to grow at 4.1% in 2022. The developing oil importers are forecasted to grow at 4.5% in 2022 and 4.3% in 2023. So looking at the left panel, here, we might not see as clearly the bifurcated or the diverging growth trajectory. But if you look at the right panel, where we adjust for the Egyptian fiscal year, you can clearly see this bifurcated growth. So in the right panel, the 2022 MENA and the developing oil importer forecast will use instead Q3 and Q4 from the 2021-2022 fiscal year, Egyptian fiscal year, rather than the 2022 fiscal year. And as a result, as this conveys more the impact of the Ukraine war and attempts to estimate the calendar year growth for Egypt, as Egypt represents like almost more than 55% of the developing oil importers. And you can see here that the growth forecast for GCC and developing oil exporters are unchanged, but the forecast for the developing oil importer reduces from 4.5% to 3.6%. And you can clearly see here the bifurcated and the diverging growth trajectory that faces the MENA exporters and the MENA importers. So now we will move to our inflation analysis. So you can see in this figure two statistics for each MENA country, the blue bar and the orange bar. The blue bar shows the average year-on-year inflation rate from October 2021 to February 2022, while the orange bar shows the average headline inflation from March 2022 to October 2022. Now, the first thing we can clearly see is that inflation in MENA is much higher today than it was a year ago. But the second thing we observe is that for many MENA countries, this inflation rate is still lower than the global inflation rate in other emerging and developing economies and in US and EU. And you can see in the red vertical line, US, in the red horizontal line, US inflation rate. The two glaring exceptions to this are Lebanon and Iran, which have had such high rates of inflation even before the onset of the war in Ukraine that they are presented on a different scale. And in both these countries, inflation was present well before the onset of the war, and it was due to these countries' domestic challenge. Why has inflation not been higher in the MENA? So we will present novel evidence concerning the imperfect path-through of global inflation to domestic prices in MENA. And we show that in most MENA countries, inflation was lower between March and October than in the United States, or would have been lower once inflation rates are adjusted for exchange rate movements since February 2022. And the reason for this is that MENA countries employed policies that reduced the amount of higher global prices for food and energy that were passed to the consumer. So here we show the framework we used. So domestic inflation is driven partly by global inflation and partly by domestic factors. And the component of domestic consumer prices driven by global inflation is called tradable inflation. And that's because it depends on the prices of globally traded goods, which are usually denominated in US dollar. And the other component depends on the domestic factors, which are the prices of non-traded goods and services. So you can see here the domestic price level in equation 1. You can see the domestic price level is actually a weighted average between the tradable price level and the non-tradable price level. And when we take the differential, and then one important parameter in equation 1 is the alpha. So this alpha represents the weight of tradables such as shoes, apparel, cars, and other traded goods, while the 1 minus alpha represents the weight for non-tradable like construction or professional services. So in equation 2, we differentiate, we take the differential and we abstract from the effect on non-tradable inflation, and we find that the price level is driven by 3 key factors. The first one is the global inflation level denominated in US dollar, which is our PT star. The second thing is the movement in the country's exchange rate relative to the US dollar. And the third is the product market intervention, the product market intervention adopted by the governments. So based on this framework, we can calculate the exchange rate adjusted inflation rate as in equation 3. And this is basically by taking away from headline inflation the part that is affected by exchange rate fluctuations. And in equation 4, we show how we calculate the policy adjusted inflation rate, which is basically by taking away from the headline inflation the part that is attributable to these product market interventions. So the first thing, the parameter I discussed, alpha, how do we calculate it? So this figure shows the distribution of, this figure shows the tradable consumption share or alpha for 16 MENA countries, which have available CPI data. The 12 countries in blue, they publish enough detailed CPI data that we are able to calculate this alpha with relative precision. For the countries in orange, they only publish the main categories in the CPI data, and so they do not offer public access to the detailed data with the subcomponents, and so we impute alpha for these countries based on other MENA countries. So the countries here are linked left to right along the horizontal axis, and poorer countries you can see tend to have higher consumption share, a higher tradable consumption share or higher alpha than middle income and higher income country, which is expected because the poor tend to spend a larger share of their income on food and energy compared to the more well-off. So here, this is the same graph I showed in an earlier slide, but we add one additional statistic to this graph, so the gray bar. So the gray bar represents the contribution. The gray bar represents the exchange rate adjusted inflation rate from March to October 2022, which are calculated by removing from headline inflation the component that reflects the local currency depreciation since February 2022. And you can see now that once we take into account local currency depreciation, inflation in most MENA countries was indeed lower than in the United States, which is here portrayed by the horizontal red line, or would have been lower had the exchange rate remained at their levels in February 2022. Even in Lebanon and Iran, which have had much higher rates of inflation, the post-February 2022 inflation would have been lower if the black market exchange rate had remained stable at 66%, and for Iran, it would have remained lower at 30%. So, as we discussed, one reason why prices or why the price increase of global tradable items were not completely reflected in MENA country is due to government tending to respond with product-specific policies such as food and energy subsidies and price controls. So this figure shows the extent to which product market policies implemented since February 2022 have affected inflation across MENA countries. The orange bar show the average headline inflation from March to October, the same as we showed before, but the gray bar shows the policy rate adjusted inflation rate. And you can see that this is basically the counterfactual average inflation rate that would have been observed had there been no changes or no new product market interventions adopted since February 2022. And the effect of these product market policies is calculated by removing the impact of the exchange rate depreciation and global tradable inflation component from headline inflation. And that's how we can identify the impact of these product market policies. And you can see that for most MENA countries, counterfactual inflation rates would have been higher than the actual rate. For example, in Egypt, the average year-on-year inflation was around 14%, while the policy rate adjusted was 19.3%, which means that government intervention reduced inflation by more than 4%, by more than 4 percentage points. Sorry. So here, this table shows the net impact of product market policies implemented since the onset of the war in Ukraine. You can see that in most countries succeeded in attenuating domestic inflation in response to rising global inflation. And this is good news, but this inflation comes at a higher cost, at a higher fiscal cost. So just to give you an idea about what kind of product market interventions, this is a qualitative look at what kind of product market interventions we looked at. So this list doesn't include standard macroeconomic policies such as increases in interest rate or supporting the national currency, but we focus on domestic product markets like increased food subsidies, new price controls, trade regulations, and also targeted social protection such as cash transfers, utility and financial support, etc. So now I will give a brief look at the fiscal cost of these product market interventions. So targeting transfers to the most vulnerable families is less costly, of course, than providing across-the-board subsidies that benefit all households. Here we use the latest household survey, consumption per capita, as well as the share of food and energy in the consumption basket to calculate the fiscal cost of compensating for the food and energy price changes between February and July 2022. So we know that for Egypt, the impact of these product market interventions was 4.1%. So we're going to assume that instead of these product market intervention, that the entire effect of this 4.1 would go towards reducing the prices of food and energy, which would be equivalent to a 9.4 percentage point increase in the food and energy prices. So assuming that we calculate the fiscal cost of compensating the population for this 9.4 percentage point increase in food and energy prices. And you can see in the orange line shows the cumulative cost of subsidizing each decile of the population from the poorest to the largest to offset this 9.4 percentage point increase in food and energy prices. And for example, if for Egypt, targeting the poorest 10% of the household to compensate for this 9.4 percentage point increase in food and energy prices would cost 0.1% of GDP. targeting the two poorest would cost 0.2%, and this would increase up, reaching 1.1% of GDP if we target the whole population. The blue line shows the relative cost of subsidizing the entire population versus the poorest decile. So you can see that targeting the whole population is 13.2 times more costly than targeting the poorest decile. Targeting the two poorest would be targeting the whole population is also 6.2 times more costly than targeting the two poorest deciles. And we also do the same exercise for the West Bank and Gaza and for Morocco, and we find that only focusing on the whole population is 18 times more costly for the West Bank and Gaza, and 17 times more costly for Morocco. So you can clearly see how the impact of these general subsidies pose an important fiscal cost on governments. So the second thing we look at is the high debt stock. So governments will have to incur additional expenses as they adopt these product market interventions and increase subsidies and cash transfers. For the GCC and developing oil exporters, this is not a big concern because they have had windfall state revenues due to the increase in the prices of hydrocarbon. But for developing oil importers, the situation is more difficult because they lack these additional hydrocarbon revenue, and so they will have to cut other expenditure and find additional revenues or increase deficit and debt to fund this extra spending. And also, as global interest rates rise, the debt service burden for oil importers will increase as they must pay a higher interest rate if they incur new debt or roll over their existing debt. So this graph, for example, shows the median public debt as percent of GDP by country group for MENA countries in the blue and for the rest of the world in the yellow. And you can see that for developing oil importers, they have an average debt to GDP ratio of 77% in 2021, while the world average is 60%. This is compared to 51% for the GCC and 56% for developing oil exporters. So you can clearly see how that the public debt for the middle income oil importers in MENA countries is significant. So this table shows back of the envelope estimates of the additional cost to government to service the debt due to the rise in global interest rate. And the costs are presented as percent of government revenues, the interest payment to revenue ratio, which is an indicator of debt affordability and a key component of debt sustainability analysis. And this ratio shows the extent to which the country's debt service burden can be financed by government revenues without needing to borrow more. And to estimate the increase in the debt service burden for 2022, the analysis focuses on domestic and market-based foreign currency debt. And to get a sense of how this increase in yield affects the debt service burden of developing oil importers, a country's additional interest payment are calculated on the assumption that it must roll over 1/3 of its domestic and market-based debt stock in the coming year, which is a conservative estimate. And these estimates focus only on the change of interest rate for market-based debt. They are therefore extremely conservative estimates of the effect of changes in global yields and interest rate on the interest burden of each country. And these estimates would therefore exclude the effect of currency depreciation. It only assumes 1/3 of the debt would need to be rolled over and is thus subject to this interest rate shock. Non-market debt, which also is affected by interest rate changes and increases in fiscal deficits. So, for example, Egypt's interest payment to revenue ratio is at 51.6%. Conservative estimate would bring this ratio to 55%, and this is only assuming that 1/3 of the debt would be rolled over and not taking into account currency depreciation since February 2022. And one last thing to highlight is that almost all developing oil importers in MENA have debt to GDP ratio that are higher than the middle income and world median. So Lebanon and Jordan, for example, are at particularly high levels, above 100%. Egypt at 92%, Tunisia at 82%, Morocco and Djibouti are at 70%. So this concludes our presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing your feedback and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hoda. Appreciate being on time as well. That's very helpful. We have two commentators or two discussants, and they are ERF fellow in this case, Dr. Layla Boghdadi and Dr. Ibrahim al-Badawi. And I think given the female, the first, I think it was listed as Ibrahim, but I'm gonna give Layla the floor first. Dr. Layla Boghdadi is a professor of economics, University of Tunis. She actually holds the World Trade Organization chair position. She is also on the executive board of the Central Bank of Tunisia, as well as the Board of Trustees of the Economic Research Forum. I have been given an instruction, Dr. Layla, that 7 to 10 minutes would be your interjection. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hassan. First, I would like to thank the ERF for the invitation to comment on this report. It is really a pleasure to be with you, colleagues, even virtually. Thank you very much, Huda, for a very clear presentation. I read with great interest the report, A New State of Mind, Greater Transparency and Accountability in the Middle East and North Africa. The whole report provides food for thought. And I have some comments, not about the methodology, but generally, the remarks I had when I have been reading your report. My comments will focus on the first chapter, which is the focus of this webinar. But I have also one remark about the overall report. Then this first chapter gives an overview of the macroeconomic development. I will not repeat again, but I think it's important to have, this image, this visualization. The main argument underlined here, why MENA have lower inflation rates than the US or the European countries, is because of price policies or product market policies such as subsidies and price control. And I found that actually, for the case of for Egypt, these policies decreased inflation by 4 percentage points than without these policies. And the back of the envelope calculation helped to show that it would cost 13.2 times more to compensate the entire population than to compensate just the lowest decile in terms of food and energy. Then this visualization, I think it's important for policymakers. It's also important for a wider audience on the importance on the cost of universal food security versus a targeted food security program. I think this is actually, it's well understood for policymakers. When I see, for instance, in Tunisia, we already decreased it. We already, dropped it out or deleted these subsidies, for instance, for energy gradually, but it's very difficult to do it for food. I have 4 comments, actually. First, in this report, the first chapter, the authors focus mainly on the Ukrainian-Russian war and the impact on inflation, where actually the component of global inflation is much more complex than that. Inflation began with COVID-2. I mean, we have a paper for Tunisia, and we show that and it finished in 2020, and we showed that actually there is inflation driven also by, and the main component is exchange rate, which is, in average, explain 50% of inflation. Well, it is it is controlled here, but still, I think it's important to have this background reflection about the drivers of inflation, because it is really complex, and it is already called by some scholars and thinkers polycrisis. And this is important also from policy point of view, because it will not end soon, even with the ending of the war. It's driven by the war, it's driven by the climate change, it's driven by supply chain, it's driven by so many other causes, and it will not end. We will not, it's not by resolving one issue that will resolve inflation. Then from the policy point of view, implementation, it's very difficult. There is a lot of uncertainties about this. Then what will be the cost? Should we every month say, okay, this will be our inflation, then the cost and the envelope we should give these transfers? Then it's very difficult, but important to do. However, the solutions are more, we should think about other solutions than only universal subsidies versus transfers. And I think since the challenges are global, solution also should be in some ways global. The authors point out of the need of governance and accountability, and actually in the presence of such uncertainties, actually governance is even more important. And I will say something about this. Second, living in Tunisia, I observed something actually, that subsidies and price controls, because of so many distortions, it adds the economy. Sometimes it will lead to the increase of inflation for other products, actually. Then, well, we can see from your report that overall effect of these policies is lowering inflation. Maybe for now, maybe in the short run, but I think we should watch the impact in the medium run. For instance, right now, we don't have sugar, we don't have subsidized products, we don't have milk, and then there is disappearance of the subsidized product, but we have an increase in other substitute products, not subsidized milk, not, there are other products, actually, we see a huge an increase in the prices. Then we need to look at the impact of these policies. And governments cannot keep up the pace with inflation, given that we don't know when it will end, using this kind of policies. Third, and this is about governance, then the authors recommend better governance and accountability to implement structural reforms, such as the reform of the subsidy system. In Tunisia, for instance, the workers' union, UGTT, fully understand that it's very costly, actually, this universal subsidies. However, they pointed out that actually they are against them because they don't trust the state to be able to implement these reforms because of governance issues. Then this is to stress that actually the governance you are putting on the table is really a problem. And it's not, then everyone knows actually that we cannot continue like this, but the main problem is actually governance. Fourth, and I need to, this is just with an, I know there is a second and third part, but I really like it, the title of the report, and the need to have a learning state. And for this, several aspects were explored in the other chapters. Some other policies were also underlined in the book of Stiglitz and Greenwald, but something I really like, and we should not understate it, is the power of beliefs. And in changing the beliefs to be able to implement reforms and enforce a learning society, or a new state of mind, as you call it, as you and this is really pertinent. Then I will end up with a citation from our first president, Habib Bourguiba, in a letter in Foreign Affairs in 1966, speaking about development post-independence. And he said, "I always felt that fault lies not with men, but with their education, their way of looking at things, their mental framework, and these can be changed for better by dint of intelligent and persistent effort. I think this will be the very challenge government in the region need to tackle in order to tackle the crisis ahead. Thank you, and I hope I didn't take a lot of your time.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Layla. I appreciate sticking again to the time. And I want to take Dr. Huda's preference. Do you want to respond to some of the comments that Dr. Layla posed here, or do you want to wait for Dr. Ibrahim as well?
Maybe we can, if Roberta is okay with it, we can take both questions, sets of questions, and then we can.
That's how it was organized, but I just wanted to make sure that you are okay with this. Well, then our own Dr. Ibrahim Al-Badawi, who is the managing director of the Economic Research Forum, and as you all know, that he also took an adventure being a Minister of Finance and Economic Planning, the Republic of Sudan recently, 2019 to 2020. He is also a Professor Emeritus at the University of Khartoum before being a lead economist at the Development Research Group of the World Bank, where he was there since 1989. There is a very big list, but I just wanted to add also that he is on the distinguished faculty at Nile University. He didn't put this there, but I would like to emphasize it as well. Dr. Ibrahim, you have also 7 to 10 minutes, please.
Let me retain the favor, Hassan, by recommending to Roberta, and Huda, of course, is she knows Egypt very well, but recommending to Roberta that the next time you are in Cairo, visit the Nile University. It's really a great university. You have the chance to visit. It's have very interesting management and technology disciplines. And I would also like to say, but don't take this from my time, Hassan. I would like to say that Roberta leadership and insight has been really great for us in terms of promoting our partnership with the Office of the Chief Economist of the World Bank. And we are always thrilled and happy to host the important contributions and reports that the Office of the Chief Economist has been making. Let me now move to, I should also mention, by the way, that hopefully we will be holding the next 29th annual conference. It will be hosted by Nile University. So that will be an opportunity also to showcase the university and the very interesting curriculum that it provides. Okay, so now let me first say that the research design is really very creative and most interesting on its own right. The idea of disaggregating the dynamics of prices, tradable prices into product market intervention component and exchange rate component. In addition, and in fact, perhaps equally impressive or even more impressive, is the policy implications of this very intuitive research, kind of very intuitive methodology that untargeted fuel and food commodity subsidies are very costly, and the price tag is made very clearly in terms of the comparisons between these untargeted subsidies for these two very critical commodities as compared to a targeted social protection in terms of cash transfers to the lowest decile, as well as to the to the lowest two deciles, the first and second. And it shows very clearly, as the report and the presentation suggested, that the cost for the budget, the direct cost for the budget, is quite significant. I think this is a very important contribution. And I would like to make a few comments, maybe 4 comments. By way of quick comments, in view of the fact that not all countries in the region, in fact, perhaps maybe more countries, most countries in the region, they don't really have robust digital platforms in place. And also societal consensus needs to be developed, needs time to be developed, so that actually these policies could be, feasible in terms of societal acceptance and so on. We just saw a statement by the leader of the, I'm sure Leila might like to speak about this as well later on, about the leader of the Workers' Association in Tunisia, flatly rejecting removal of or reform of any commodity subsidies. And given the importance of this association, it might take some time to actually develop a consensus at the institutional level. But then at the technical level, which is probably more constraining, is that you need to build a robust system of digital identities and platforms and so on. But let me say that actually, in this case, perhaps maybe some targeting could be done within the food categories itself. I'm not an expert in this area, but one of our lead, affiliates, research fellows, Professor Paul Mardisi of the University of Ottawa, and his research associates have done some very interesting research about using the methodology of consumption dominance approach to assess the relative impact on poverty of specific commodities within the food sector. For example, for the case of Egypt, they found that the impact on poverty is much greater subsidizing lentil, for example, as a commodity, as opposed to bread or some other commodities. But the idea is that as an interim period, perhaps this could be, for future research, could be, and policy engagement could be interesting to the extent that some countries might actually need to take some time. So there may be targeting even within the commodity subsidies. For the case of Sudan, when I was a minister, we decided actually to keep the subsidies on bread because it's such an important, food staple. But certainly, there are some other technical things that needs to be done to assess the relative impact on poverty of this, especially in our countries, including Egypt and Tunisia and many and other countries in North Africa in particular, but also in Jordan and certainly Lebanon. There are so many middle class or upper, middle class, or those, just above the poverty line, bunched above the poverty line, and any kind of shock, especially on food, are likely to bring them below the poverty line. And so perhaps maybe there is need for some interim adjustment to the more robust cash transfer type of social protection. I'm a strong supporter of the approach of the report. Eventually, that's what needs to be done, but this could be an interim process to reduce the cost of commodity subsidies and make subsidies within the food sector in particular to be, kind of targeted or selective. I think it would be also interesting to control, as Leila said, for the, to further articulate the inflation adjusted for real exchange rate equilibrium. because what is happening really is that in this formula, there is an adjustment for product market intervention, which is really an innovative way, but the exchange rate is just left as a crude number, as a crude indicator. And this does not distinguish between those countries that use the nominal exchange rate as a nominal anchor, as opposed to monetary aggregates and debt as nominal anchors. Because the cost of suppressing the exchange rate, because it might appear that the exchange rate is moving very fast in the region as a result of these shocks, but it could still be appreciated relative to the equilibrium, because the economies are disarticulated with low productivity and so on and so forth. So therefore, perhaps maybe a slightly more complicated formula, but very useful formula, is to adjust for the distance from the equilibrium exchange rate. And then this will allow you to control for the inflation, assuming that the real exchange rate is kept in a disequilibrium and appreciated relative to the equilibrium, because it would also enlighten the discussion about the implications, the medium to longer term run implications for competitiveness of the economy, which is really an important thing. The second point I wanted to say is in the view of the indirect cost, not only for the budget, but also for debt and exchange rate and monetary policy. I believe it's not only macroeconomic policy, it's really the macroeconomic strategy that is the big elephant in the room. How we conduct macroeconomic policy, as a strategy, and the institutions that controls macroeconomic policy, both at the level of fiscal and as well as the level of monetary and exchange rate. So a macroeconomic strategy built around high interest rates, low fiscal efforts, and low national saving, and accelerated open arms capital flows is bound to undermine the effectiveness of social policy for fighting poverty and enhancing gender equality. This is an important point, I think, from the development perspective. The reason being is why is this? Because actually high interest rate hampers access to finance by SMEs, especially tradable SMEs, affecting job opportunities, most notably for the poor and women. And more recently, one of our lead experts, Professor Raja Asad, argues that the demise or the limited progress in terms of achieving growth and expansion of tradable sector activities have actually limited female labor force participation, because these are the sectors that has historically been very important for providing job opportunities for women. The ensuing RAR in real exchange rate overvaluation, as I said earlier, undermines competitiveness and add another channel to the above impact. So, and also when the inevitable correction happens, when correction happens now, actually capital flows are no longer coming. So most likely exchange rate will have to adjust. And so the poor are likely to bear the brunt of the ensuing devaluation and inflation. So this is really, I think, drawing the implications for the macroeconomic strategy that has been adopted by many countries in the region, and assessing the potential impact on the effectiveness and sustainability of social protection, even when these countries finally decide to adopt some measure of social protection. Then also, obviously, I would say that finally, that there is the need to link, and maybe this is more for the second phase of the report, of the presentation of the report, is that cash transfers, it really need to be presented as a central piece of the emerging social contract, especially in terms of engaging the middle class. For example, living here in Egypt and had the opportunity to talk to some Egyptians who are, should be considered part of the middle class. They complain about the quality of social services, education and health, and that they have to pay for private service, social services, private schools, private hospitals and medical care and so on. And they are the ones who pay taxes. And so they see, for example, energy, in particular energy subsidy, as making amend for their limited benefit from what the states provide. So I think engaging the private sector that actually, the state would commit to use the saving from pivoting or moving away from commodity subsidies to more broad-based social targeting, more effective in terms of cost and in terms of impact, would avail to the state the opportunity to enhance the quality and to expand the capacity to provide social services in education and health. And this, I think, would be very important. And I just want to conclude that maybe Roberta would remember that old good days when the gross empirical literature have started to emerge, and very interesting paper by Bill Easterly on gross and middle class consensus. I think middle class consensus in this region is very important for generating the buy-in and supporting the eventual conclusions from these very important and useful macro economic diagnostic work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ibrahim. It's quite a list there. So let me invite Dr. Huda. And of course, Dr. Roberta has the freedom to intervene whenever is convenient for her as well. Dr. Huda, please, you have again about 5 to 10 minutes to answer because we need to take some question from the floor. Go ahead, please.
So Roberta can start by answering some of the questions.
Okay.
Let me, first of all, let me say thank you for a lot of food for thought that was put on the table. And I know already that my answer won't give justice to these excellent comments. Something that I wanted to maybe stress about the angle that we took in thinking about inflation is that we really tried to highlight the link between monetary policy and fiscal policy. And both Dr. Leila and Dr. Ibrahim brought to the fore the question of how monetary policy is being done, thinking about the ramifications on the politics of the region, on the sort of inequality of the region. What we wanted to do here was something rather modest, which was to link a monetary phenomenon to its fiscal implication. It's sort of going back to a sort of 101 of macroeconomics. The spirit that we had there was of there's no free lunch. And I think that we all agree that although controlling inflation with product market policies might have an immediate benefit in terms of maintaining social cohesion, maintaining social peace, the cost is non-negligible. This cost is high in the countries that have used these products very intensively, such as Egypt and Tunisia. And it builds on existing vulnerabilities, which are, I think, expressed best by the stock of high debt that some of these countries find themselves with. So that was the part that we wanted to highlight the most, particularly because product market interventions are a choice of the government. And there are alternative ways of reacting to high inflation. going back to what Dr. Ibrahim was saying, think about universal subsidies and targeted interventions. Something that I wanted to say, not to be sort of always putting a wet blanket on the discourse that we have in MENA. For someone like myself who used to work in the region more than 10 years ago, it was an absolute delight and pleasure to see that countries like Egypt, Jordan, Morocco have done tremendous progress in systems of digital identity, systems of identification of the poor. And these countries have been countries who, even worldwide, have been the fastest in responding to increases in prices, to the pandemic crisis, and so on. So the tool is there, the social registries are there. The question of not using only cash transfers to respond to compensate the poor is probably more of a political economy choice rather than an economic choice. And what we wanted to stress here was the economic cost of a choice that might have seemed inevitable from the political side. And we all know that there is a vast literature, and we also know from experience from the Arab Spring that when prices increase, in particular food prices increase, the risk of demonstrations and sort of social unrest is much higher. So in that sense, I was also trying to answer one of the questions that I saw in the chat is like, why are we talking more about the exchange rate, which is the sort of a dominant factor in determining the inflation? We chose to focus on policies where policymakers had a choice: subsidies or cash transfers. I think that Dr. Leila said something very wise, which is it's easier somehow to roll back the energy subsidies, but the resistance to roll back the food subsidies is dramatic. I don't think that with this report we have unearthed everything about it. And just by way of sort of giving the heads up is that we're working now on really thinking about what is the impact of increased food prices on human capital. And that will be the topic, the special topic of the economic update that will come out in April. So I think that you have put the finger on something that is extraordinarily complex from the political side. And what we wanted to do was to highlight the economic costs. Dr. Leila also said something that is very important and shows some of the limitations of the analysis that we have done so far. There are knock-on effects of subsidies that work in many ways through distortions in the market. So Dr. Leila spoke about shortages, and clearly if a country controls the price with a price cap, or subsidizes in certain ways certain products at certain levels of the production chain, it creates distortions that might give the sort of unwanted signals to the private sector. And that's probably what is causing shortages, because some prices are too controlled and the producers do not have the signal that usually prices would give in terms of increasing production. There are also cross effects, and I think that some of them we capture in our analysis. So what the computation that Dr. Hoda, Dr. Danielle, and Dr. Ernest have done, and Dr. Hoda can speak more to it herself, they do not always bring about a drop in inflation. Sometimes they create they trigger an increase in inflation because they are cross links across products and substitutions. So let me conclude on something that I look forward to discussing with you in the next talk, which is the second part, which is the idea of how governance and better measurement and accountability can really be an important policy lever even now. So now we've been talking about inflation, debt, and you could say, what do transparency and accountability have to do with it? And that's why I would like to sort of bring back this concept to really link it to how important they are now. So if we think about the oil importers, and I'm focusing more now on them, but this is, I think, the one sort of unicorn, one-size-fits-all policy that really would be good for all of the countries in our region. If we think first about the oil importing countries, these are countries that are in fiscal are already in fiscal distress or might be approaching fiscal distress. These are countries that need to weigh very carefully their fiscal policies in the futures. And if we think about Egypt, what Dr. Hoda showed, even in the very basic, and I agree with the comment in the chat, in the very basic, and basic in the sense of very conservative simulation of what is the debt interest burden and how it increases in our countries. Just for Egypt, half of the revenues in Egypt go to pay interest on the debt. Sophisticated or not, this is something that gives us pause, because it means that, and talking to the point that Dr. Ibrahim made about the discontent vis-a-vis the quality of social services, if half of your revenues go to pay the interest in the debt, what is left to finance the type of quality that a country that is so promising like Egypt, the type of quality of social services that a country like Egypt would need? So that was where we were coming from. And improving transparency and accountability is something that can really align incentives in the economy at a very low cost. So the price tag of doing something like that is a reform that is a stroke of the pen. And it's something that even countries that are now with very restrictive fiscal space could do. Let me conclude also with a thought to GCC countries. They are now in a moment of boom, but this boom we know is temporary, because if we look, and Dr. Hoda put up the sort of price of oil up to 2030, we all know that the predictions is that this price will converge to $70 a barrel. So it's a boom now, but it's an extraordinary opportunity for GCC countries to actually experiment and adaptively think about what they need to do to move towards a broader base growth. And that's where, again, measuring and aligning incentives is something that would really help even countries that are doing extraordinarily well right now. So let me stop here and turn to Dr. Hoda, and then I'm happy to pick up any other topics that I might not have addressed. But for the moment, thank you for this fantastic food for thought. We took copious notes, and we'll have to think for quite a while to really address it all. Hoda?
Thank you very much, Roberta. Thank you, everybody, for all the comments and feedback. They've been very insightful and helpful. So I can just answer some of the questions and comments. So, Dr. Lala, you mentioned that what we show is that the overall impact of these product market intervention is to lower inflation in the short term. But what about the impact on the medium and long term? So that's something I think that the fiscal calculation we did touches upon it, is how expensive it is and how fiscally costly it is for government to do these kind of like universal subsidies, and how it's important to move towards more targeted subsidies. And so I think that's like, I mean, it shows that in the long term this is not sustainable. And also the debt vulnerability analysis also helps into making this point, that it's in the medium and long term this would be too costly, and governments will have to find other approaches. And also another thing you touched upon about how inflation is more complex and how it started even earlier than the Ukraine war, and that's true. Inflation, I mean, since the COVID-19 pandemic and disruption in the supply chains, all of this has increased inflation, but it has really accelerated since the Ukraine war, and also the big shock to the food and energy prices because of the Ukraine war and because of Russia and Ukraine being important exporters of these two particular commodities, and how important these two commodities are for the MENA region. I think is specifically the reason we focus on this. But you're correct that it's a much more complex phenomenon. And so and I would also want to touch upon two questions that were in the Q&A. So in the third question, they asked Ayman Belgasem asked about to explain why the impact of product regulation on inflation is different for some countries, is lower for some countries than in others. So this is a percentage point effect, which means that for countries that already have low inflation, the percentage point decrease in inflation due to the product market intervention will be lower. So for example, you have Bahrain, who has a current inflation of 3.6, it's 3.6, and it would have 3.6% and would have been 4.2% if the authorities had intervened. So this 0.6 percentage point is due to this 0.6 percentage point decrease is due to the lower base effects as compared to, for example, Egypt, which had an inflation rate of 14%. So that is why. And then the second question, that you are correct that taking into account broader impact of this global increase in prices would have a bigger impact. But in this in our analysis, we chose to abstract away from any effects on non-tradable inflation, which is why our estimates are actually more conservative. And if we took into account the impact of these global prices on non-tradable inflation, it would be the impact of these interventions would be even higher.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Huda. Appreciate your taking on these questions. So I think there is.
I forgot to answer one question about remittances. I'm sorry.
Yes.
If I may, I just wanted to say two words. I think this was
I would have just bold it now. That was my intention. Go ahead, please.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Anand. Sorry, I was just going back to the chat and I just noticed it. So I think this is a very good question. And what we saw about remittances, although, sorry, I have the sun coming in my room, so well, there's nothing I can do about it, sorry. So what we see in the region is that so first of all, in 2020, going back to the pandemic, there was a sort of sudden halt to migration, but it was very limited in time. And then migration really continued through the pandemic. And what we saw in terms of remittances is there was a tremendous rebound and growth of remittances in 2021, which was driven by the rebound in growth in Europe and also by the GCCs. And definitely what was happening in Spain, in Italy, and in France was really boosting the remittances to the Maghreb. And also there was a significant growth in Egypt. I don't have the crystal ball to tell you exactly what will happen in 2022, but the forces that Dr. Amin points at are correct. A sort of softening of growth in Europe will likely make this sort of pattern of remittances plateaued, while we could expect that in the GCC countries, remittances back to Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt will grow. I can't exactly predict what will happen due to the fact that in advanced countries, we see a lot of sort of great, I think it's called the great renunciation, the great, people just drop out of the labor force. And so it's possible that as people drop out of the labor force in advanced countries, and as the need for the type of skills that often migrants from the southern border of the rim of the Mediterranean provide, including nurses, including care, which sees an increase in demand in Europe, might sort of strengthen instead migration and hence remittances. But of course, the great uncertainty there is what is happening in Ukraine and with the Russian war in Ukraine. And so I'm not even touching upon the question of refugees, but thinking about official aid flows, there has been a sort of diversion of official aid flows towards the great crisis of refugees in Ukraine. And I think that in our region, somehow Yemen is likely to take the brunt of that diversion of flows. So thank you for this opportunity, and sorry for having forgotten earlier, Dr. Hassan.
No, not a problem. Thank you so much. I just have a comment, maybe it's implied question here in the analysis that has been done. Something very interesting, and I really like it. The government intervention, whether it's through the product market intervention, in this case, or the targeted social protection. And I see, Hoda, that there is a decline in the actual inflation rate because of these different policies, so to speak. But do I get the understanding that the policy is a standard? I mean, if you want to say that for Egypt, it has been reduced by 4%, but in other countries, it was reduced by 2%. Are you comparing these two countries with the same kind of measure that been taken, or with different measures? I'm just trying to imply that maybe it's useful to have the same measure, and then we know that this measure has certain efficiency in reducing inflation.
Thank you very much for your question. So what we did is basically we had a more of a qualitative approach to this, looking at what kind of measures were announced, for example, in the press that were adopted, and that's why we create this table which shows the different where we check where each kind of measure was adopted in each country. So countries adopted very different approaches. Some countries adopted price controls, other countries adopted food and fuel subsidies. Some countries adopted tax exemptions. There were some countries adopted targeted subsidies, targeted social protection. One thing I would highlight is that all these policies are not existing one. These are additional or new policies adopted since the start of the Ukraine war in February 22. So in just a short amount of time, this is the additional impact of this new product market intervention. I think that it might be more difficult to kind of tease out the effect of each individual policy, and it might be more difficult to do that. So that's why we look at them as a group. But yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Hoda. I think there is a question by Dr. Haddad about the demand versus the supply impact. It has been explained by the analysis here. And again, the main cause of inflation when the exchange rate regime is different. So this is all the question that being given. And I also have, I think, a question by Dr. In addition to the remittance, there was something also being added by Dr. Amin that has to do with the IMF 5 billion package to Egypt. He is basically saying that we all know that mandating the flexible exchange regime on Egypt is going to produce inflation. So how the country planning to address the inflationary pressure, I think that's up to the Egyptian government official to answer. But if you have anything to add, Roberta.
I am happy to share a couple of thoughts, and Hoda should feel free also to do the same. So on the question of the demand, thinking about what determines inflation, that's not the question that we started with in this report. So we don't have our own work on it, but a few considerations. Clearly, if you think about the US, we have an economy that, because of the large support package that was extended during the pandemic, was overheated. And so there is a consensus that in the US, inflation, you can also see the different, in a graph that we put up, the different dynamics of inflation in the US, which is much more about core inflation rather than energy. That there is a sort of demand side determinant that is really kicking in very strongly. I would say intuitively in our region, I don't think that the output gap is such that it is likely to be a strong determinant of inflation. But on this, I need to take the fifth, and I would actually need to look at the data with more detail. So that's my sort of intuitive explanation. And we see that, the exchange rate for the countries where that had that type of flexibility was the number one determinant of what happens to inflation, which brings us to Egypt. I think, Dr. Hanan, the authorities will know better than me, but in 2015-16, when there was the sort of devaluation of the Egyptian pound, my understanding was that Egypt was supposed, and I think is still classified as a sort of flexible exchange rate, but the reality was that it was a sort of managed, highly managed float, and we saw how it sort of happened over time. I see the exchange rate in Egypt as a sort of an expression, a symptom of problems that come from the fiscal side. And I see this as a sort of expression of somehow fiscal dominance that is happening in Egypt, rather than a problem of where the exchange rate should be. If we need to think about what should authority do if this leads to inflation, which is likely to do, well, there will be a gain in competitiveness, as it was with the sort of devaluation in 2015. I hope that much will be done to sort of take the benefit of this competitiveness, also through identifying policies that put the private sector on a level playing field with the SOEs, so that that devaluation can really bring and foster that growth that the country needs. In terms of how to protect people, I think that we showed the evidence that having a strong and well-targeted system of transfer, and Egypt is in a good position to do that, would be the sort of fiscally savvy way to go.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I think we are almost out of time. Let me just thank the engine behind this vehicle, Shireen Ghunaim. Dr. Shireen, thank you very much. You and your team, Namis, and our interpreter, Noha and Rahab. Thank you all very much. I appreciate all the effort being done. This was a magnificent presentation. Thank you, Dr. Huda, and of course, Dr. Roberta, and all the co-authors in your report. I'm looking forward for the second stage in this case. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your hospitality, Dr. Hassan. Thank you, Dr. Shireen, for having us, Dr. Leila, Dr. Ibrahim, for having shared with us your insights, and thank you, Dr. Hoda, for taking our report out in the world. So it was a pleasure to be your guest and an honor.
Everybody, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.